There is a mill at the edge of the Ardennes forest. It stands where it has always stood, on the bank of a stream that runs dark and cold through the trees. Its stone walls thick enough to have survived 2 world wars and everything those wars brought with them. The wheel still turns, slowly, in winter, when the water runs heavy with cold and the ice builds at the edges of the stream and the forest presses in from all sides with the particular silence of a place that has been accumulating darkness for a very long time. Local people do not go near it after dark. They have not gone near it after dark for a long time. Not since the First War. Not since the winter of 1916, when something happened in that mill that nobody who was there ever spoke about clearly, and nobody who wasn't there ever fully understood. The stories that survived were fragments, half-sentences. The kind of account that stops before it reaches the part you most need to hear. In December of 1944, 4 men took shelter in that mill for a single night. A British sergeant, a British private, an American soldier, and the 16-year-old Belgian boy who knew exactly what was in that building and had spent 3 years trying to forget it. By morning, all 4 of them had left, but none of them left with everything they brought in. This is what happened in the mill at the edge of the Ardennes, on the night the war came inside. Before we go in, welcome. Whether you found this at midnight with your headphones in and the lights already off, or you've been here before and you know what these stories do to the hours between now and morning, it's genuinely good to have you here. If you're new, stay. Get comfortable. This one runs for 2 hours and it earns every minute of them. If you've been here since the beginning, you already know to turn the lights down. Drop a comment before you drift off. Just tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I read every single one. There's something about knowing that someone in Oslo and someone in Melbourne and someone in a small town in Ohio are all lying in the dark at the same time, listening to the same story. Something that makes the dark feel a little less like something to be afraid of, and a little more like something we're all moving through together. Subscribe if you haven't. It costs nothing, and it means everything. And now, lights down. We're going into the mill. The Ardennes in December was a place that had given up entirely on the concept of warmth. It had not always been this way. In summer, the forest was a thing of genuine beauty, green and deep and full of a particular European stillness that had nothing threatening in it. That was simply the stillness of very old trees in a very old landscape, doing what trees did, which was grow slowly and make shade and pay no particular attention to the affairs of the creatures moving around at their roots. In autumn, the color came. The red and amber and the deep brown gold of beech leaves against a sky that was still sometimes blue, still sometimes generous. People walked here in autumn. Before the war, people had walked here. December was a different matter. December in the Ardennes of 1944 was a place that seemed to have made a decision. The decision was that it was done with color and done with warmth, and done with the pretense that any of this was going to be all right. The trees were black. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and featureless, pressing down on the canopy as though trying to flatten it. The snow that had fallen 3 days ago had not melted, had no intention of melting, and had instead compressed itself into a hard gray-white crust that covered the forest floor and the logging, tracks, and the frozen stream banks and everything else in an even, indifferent layer that muffled sound and erased distinction and made the whole forest feel like a room that someone had stopped using and closed the door on. Sergeant William Croft heard it before he saw it. The water first, the low, cold sound of a stream moving under ice, pushing against it from below, the particular sound of water that is trying very hard not to freeze entirely and is only partially succeeding. Then the creak, a slow, rhythmic, mechanical sound that his mind processed as significant before he had consciously identified what it was. Then he came around a bend in the logging track, and the mill resolved itself out of the darkness and the trees and the snow, and he stopped, and the 3 people behind him stopped. And they all looked at it in silence for a moment. It was large, larger than he had expected, though he hadn't been expecting anything specific. He had been told there was a mill by a map reference and a brief note in the company commander's last transmission, and he had formed no particular mental image of it, which was usually the right approach. The building was stone, thick-walled, 2 stories, with a steeply pitched roof that had shed most of its snow onto the ground around it. The mill wheel was on the near side, turning slowly in the stream, ice-furred on the paddles, turning with that low creak he had heard from the track. A wooden footbridge crossed the stream to the mill door. The door itself was closed. The windows were dark. "That," said Cooper, from somewhere behind Croft's left shoulder. "That's it," Croft said. Looks like somebody's grandmother's house, Cooper said. If somebody's grandmother lived in the middle of nowhere and didn't believe in curtains. Private Danny Walsh said nothing. He was 19 and he had learned over the past 6 weeks that the most reliable indicator of how much danger you were in was the degree to which Sergeant Croft was saying nothing. And Sergeant Croft was currently saying nothing with a focused quality that suggested he was doing a great deal of thinking behind it. Walsh looked at the mill and tried to determine what Croft was seeing that he wasn't. The building looked empty. It looked cold and dark and closed and empty, and the wheel turned in the stream with its slow creak, and the snow lay on the roof and the ground around it, and there was no light in any window and no smoke from the chimney and no indication of any occupant past or present, except for the wheel turning in the water, which Walsh supposed was what wheels did. Whether anyone was there to see them or not, he looked at Luke. The Belgian boy was standing at the back of the group, slightly apart, in the way he had been standing slightly apart from the group since they had found him on the road 4 hours ago, half frozen and walking east with no coat and one boot that was coming apart at the sole. He was 16, thin in the way people were thin after 4 years of occupation, with a face that was older than 16 in the ways that mattered, and younger than 16 in the ways that made Walsh's chest do something uncomfortable when he looked at it too directly. He had given his name as Luke. He had indicated through a combination of French too fast for anyone to follow and gestures that were clear enough that he knew this area and could guide them to shelter. He had guided them here, and now he was standing at the back of the group looking at the mill with an expression that Walsh couldn't read precisely, but that contained, somewhere in it, something that was not quite fear and not quite resignation and sat in the space between the two with a kind of exhausted familiarity. "Look," Croft said. The boy looked at him. Croft pointed at the mill, then looked at the boy. The question needed no translation. Luke looked at the mill for a long moment. Then he looked back at Croft. He said something in French. Croft looked at Walsh, who had 6 weeks of broken French acquired in Normandy and knew it was not going to be adequate. Walsh listened and caught perhaps half of it. Mon grand-père, my grandfather en vieux, old, and something that might have been pas bien, not good, and something else that Walsh definitely caught but wished he hadn't, because the word for les morts, the dead, was one of the words he learned early in a war and did not forget. "What did he say?" Cooper asked. "Something about his grandfather," Walsh said, "and something about the dead." Cooper looked at the mill, looked at the boy, looked at Walsh. "His grandfather's dead," Cooper said. "Everybody's grandfather is dead. That's what grandfathers do." He shouldered his rifle. "I'm going in. My feet stopped working about an hour ago, and I need a fire." Croft watched him go. Then he looked at Luce again. "Dangerous?" he said. The word was the same in both languages. "Close enough." Luke looked at the mill. He said, "Je ne sais pas." "I don't know." Then, after a pause that Walsh felt in his back teeth, "Peut-être." "Perhaps." Croft nodded slowly, in the way he nodded when someone had confirmed something he had already suspected. "Right," he said. "We go in. We stay together. We sleep in rotation. 2 up, 2 down. Nobody wanders." He looked at Walsh. "Nobody." Walsh understood that the nobody was specifically him. "Yes, Sergeant," he said. They crossed a footbridge. The wheel turned in the black water below them as they crossed, and the sound of it, that slow, rhythmic creak, was the sound Walsh heard for the rest of that night every time the mill went quiet and there was nothing else to listen to. He heard it in his sleep for years afterward. On the nights when he slept, the interior of the mill smelled of stone and damp and something older, the particular smell of a building that had been processing grain for a very long time. Flour dust worked into every surface, into the pores of the stone itself, sweet and faintly dusty and utterly out of place in December 1944. The ground floor was the working floor. The great millstones were there, 2 pairs of them, the upper stones cold and still, wooden chutes and hoppers, the machinery of the milling process. Gears and axles of dark old iron connected to the wheel outside through a shaft that ran through the wall just above the water line. The shaft was turning. Walsh noticed this because it was the only moving thing in the room. Everything else was still and cold and stopped, but the shaft from the wheel was turning slowly as the wheel turned outside and the gears it connected to were turning with it, and the machinery of the mill was moving, not milling anything, not processing anything, just turning in the cold dark with the low sound of old iron doing what old iron did when it had been doing it for a long time and hadn't been told to stop. "Can we stop that?" Walsh said. "Why?" Cooper said. "Why Joker 2222 hum? Have a good answer for why." "It's loud," he said, which was not entirely true. It wasn't loud, it was just present. Just consistently and rhythmically present in the way something became loud when you were trying to sleep and it wouldn't stop. "Leave it," Croft said. He was doing his survey of the space, the methodical, unhurried inspection of a man who had been securing rooms since 1940 and had developed strong opinions about exits. "Stairs, second floor. Walsh, check it." Walsh checked it. The second floor was a storage and living space, low-ceilinged, heavy-beamed, smelling more of habitation than the working floor below. A rope bed frame in one corner, the mattress long gone. A table. 2 chairs. A stone fireplace with a rusted iron grate. A stack of old wood beside it, dry enough to be promising. A shelf with 3 or 4 objects on it that Walsh's torch passed over quickly. He would look more carefully later. 2 small windows, both intact, both shuttered from inside. He went back to the stairs. "Clear," he said. "Fireplace upstairs, dry wood." Cooper was already on the stairs. Croft looked at Luke, who had come inside and was standing near the door with his hands in his pockets. Looking at the millstones with an expression Walsh was beginning to understand was the boy's default in this building. Not frightened, exactly, but watching, waiting, as though he was monitoring something that hadn't yet decided what it was going to do. "Luke," Croft said. "Upstairs." The boy looked at the ceiling. At the floor above, he looked back at Croft. He went upstairs. They made a fire. It was a small fire. Croft's instinct was always minimal light, minimal smoke, minimal indication of occupation. But it was a fire, and the heat from it began almost immediately to do what heat did to cold men, which was make them remember what it was like to be human. Walsh sat as close to it as Croft would permit, which was slightly closer than was strictly sensible, but not so close as to be a problem. Cooper sat across from him with his boots off, examining his feet with the focused displeasure of a man who has discovered that his feet have been having a worse time than he had authorized. Luke sat apart. He had chosen the corner farthest from the fire, farthest from the warmth, which struck Walsh as a strange choice. And he was sitting with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up and his eyes on the floor between his feet. He had accepted the ration Walsh offered him and eaten it quickly and thoroughly, which told Walsh something about the last time he had eaten. He had not spoken since they came inside. Walsh watched him. The fire settled. The iron grate made small sounds. Outside, the wheel turned in the stream, and the shaft turned in the wall below them, and the gears on the ground floor turned with it, and the sound of it came up through the floor. That slow, rhythmic quality, not quite a sound, more a vibration that you felt in the soles of your feet and the base of your spine. "Croft," Walsh said quietly. The sergeant looked at him. Walsh tilted his head toward Luke. Croft looked at the boy for a moment. Then he crossed the room and crouched in front of him, bringing his face to the boy's level, which was the approach of a man who had done this before, spoken to civilians in the aftermath of things, children in the aftermath of things, and knew that the first requirement was to remove the height differential. "Luke," he said, "your grandfather, he lived here?" The boy looked at him. "Ishi?" Croft said. "Here?" Luke nodded. "And now?" Croft said. A pause. "Il est mort," Luke said. "He is dead. He is dead." "When?" The boy looked at the floor, then at the fire, then at something in the middle distance that was not the floor or the fire or anything Walsh could see. "Dick Snuff senses," he said. Walsh did the arithmetic. 1916. 28 years ago. The First War. Croft held the boy's gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded, slowly, and stood, and came back to the fire, and stood looking into it with his hands behind his back. "Sergeant," Walsh said. "I heard," Croft said. "What does it mean?" Croft was quiet for a moment. "It means," he said, "that we sleep in rotation. 2 up, 2 down. And we leave at first light regardless of conditions." He looked at Walsh. "Regardless." Walsh looked at the floor, at the boards beneath which the machinery turned. "Yes, Sergeant," he said. They drew lots for the watch rotation. Croft and Luke took first watch. not because Luke had drawn it, but because Croft had decided it, quietly, without explanation, in the way he decided most things. And Walsh had learned that Croft's unexplained decisions were usually the ones that mattered most. Walsh and Cooper would sleep first, 4 hours. Then they would swap. Walsh lay down on the floor near the fire with his greatcoat over him, and his rifle beside him, and his helmet under his head. And he closed his eyes and he listened to the mill, the fire, the creak and turn of the machinery below, the wind at the shuttered windows, not loud, just present. The constant low note of a December night in the Ardennes pressing against the building from outside, Croft's boots on the floor, the slow, even pacing of a man on watch who is doing it properly, moving to stay warm, moving to stay alert. Luke. No sound from Luke, which Walsh had noticed was the boy's primary characteristic, a stillness and silence that went beyond shyness into something more considered. Cooper was asleep in approximately 4 minutes. Walsh knew this because Cooper's breathing changed in 4 minutes from the slightly performative stillness of a man trying to sleep to the genuine, unconscious rhythm of a man who had succeeded, and also because Cooper, asleep, produced a low and completely steady sound from the back of his throat that was not quite a snore and was significantly more than a breath, and that Walsh had spent 6 nights learning to sleep through and had not yet entirely mastered. He focused on the fire. The fire was doing what fires did, consuming itself slowly, the wood breaking down into coal and ash, the flames settling from the initial bright eager reach of fresh fuel into the lower, more considered burn of established heat. Shadows moved on the ceiling, long shadows from the beams, shifting slowly as the fire shifted. Walsh watched the shadows. He was almost asleep, that particular floating state where the mind is present but loosely, where thoughts arrive without being summoned and depart without conclusion. When he heard it, from below, not the machinery, not the turning of the shaft or the movement of the gears, something different, a sound that took him several seconds to identify, lying there in the half-dark with his eyes now open and his body very still. Footsteps, on the ground floor, slow, deliberate, the sound of someone moving through the milling floor, around the millstones, between the hoppers and chutes, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew the space intimately. Walsh sat up. He looked at Croft. Croft was already looking at the floor. His hand was on his rifle. His expression was the one Walsh had learned to read as, "I hear it too. Stay still. Let me think." Walsh stayed still. The footsteps continued for a moment, unhurried, purposeful, and then stopped. Then, from the ground floor, came a sound that Walsh had absolutely no framework for and that his mind therefore refused, for a full 3 seconds, to process at all. A voice, low, male, speaking in a language that was neither English nor French nor German, or perhaps it was French, Old French. French spoken in a register and with an accent, so thick and so different from anything Walsh had encountered that he couldn't be certain, not loud, not distressed. Speaking in the tone of a man giving instructions, matter of fact, practical, directed at someone nearby. And then a second voice answering, different pitch, also male, also that strange thick French, also matter of fact, 2 men, on the ground floor, having a conversation. Walsh looked at Croft. Croft looked at him. Walsh looked at Luke. The boy was sitting in his corner with his knees drawn up and his face turned slightly away from the floor, turned away from the sound. Walsh realized, in the specific way you turned away from something you had been expecting and were not ready to face. Croft crossed to Walsh in 2 steps, crouched beside him, spoke very quietly. "Stay here," he said. "Keep Cooper quiet if he wakes. Sergeant, stay here." Croft went to the stairs. He went down them slowly, one at a time, rifle ready, using the wall for reference, making almost no sound. Walsh watched the top of the staircase and listened. The voices on the ground floor stopped. Silence. Complete. Total. The silence of a space that has been making sound and has suddenly stopped making it, which is a different silence from one that was silent to begin with. Walsh heard Croft's boots on the ground floor. Movement. A pause. More movement. Then Croft's boots on the stairs again. Coming up. The same careful pace going up as going down, measured and unhurried. He came back into the upper room and stood near the fire and said nothing for a moment. "Sergeant," Walsh said. "Nobody there," Croft said. "But..." "Nobody there," Croft said, "but..." "Nobody there," Croft said again, not dismissing it, not explaining it, just stating the fact of what he had found, which was nothing, and setting it beside the fact of what they had both heard, which was not nothing, and leaving the distance between those two facts where it was, unresolved. Because there was nothing to be done about it at 3 a.m. in a mill in the Ardennes. He went back to his watch. Walsh lay back down. He did not sleep again. He lay with his eyes open and listened to the fire and the machinery and the wind. And at some point, he couldn't have said when, he became aware that the voices had returned. Quieter now. Barely there. The low murmur of a conversation happening just below the threshold of clarity, just below the level at which you could make out words or even the shape of sentences. But there, continuous, patient. 2 men on the ground floor talking about something that was, to them, simply the ongoing business of the day. Walsh lay still and listened to them talk. He did not hear words. He heard underneath the words something else, a quality of the sound itself that he had no name for. A texture, an age, as though the voices were not coming from the floor below, but from somewhere further down, somewhere deeper than the stone foundation, somewhere that the building sat on top of but did not contain. He lay still and listened until Croft touched his shoulder at 4 a.m. and told him his watch had started. And then he got up, quietly, and took his post, and tried not to look at the floor. Cooper's watch was a different matter. Cooper, woken at 4, took approximately 6 minutes to move from asleep to fully operational, which Walsh had observed was the man's consistent performance regardless of circumstances. He sat up. He put his boots on. He ate something from his ration pack. He looked around the room with the alert, unimpressed gaze of a man assessing a situation he had not chosen and did not particularly endorse. "Anything," he said. "Quiet," Walsh said. This was technically true. The voices had stopped when Croft had come down for his rest and had not returned. The machinery continued. The wind continued. The fire was lower but still present. Walsh lay down and closed his eyes. He heard Cooper settle into his watch position, the chair by the window, which Cooper had decided was the correct place to be, because from the chair by the window he could see both the staircase and the door to the roof space, which were the 2 points of entry he had identified, and which his entirely rational mind told him were the only points of entry that mattered. Walsh was not asleep. He was lying still with his eyes closed, listening. For approximately 20 minutes nothing happened. Cooper's watch was quiet in the way Cooper was quiet when he had nothing to say, which was a different quiet from the mill's quiet, more finite, more human. Walsh heard him shift in the chair, heard him breathe. Heard him, once, mutter something under his breath that had the quality of a complaint directed at nobody in particular, which was one of Cooper's conversational habits. Then Walsh heard him stop. Not the normal stop, someone who has run out of things to mutter. A different stop. A sudden, complete stop. The stop of someone whose attention has been completely arrested by something. Walsh opened his eyes. Cooper was sitting forward in the chair. He was looking at the stairs. Walsh followed his gaze. The staircase was dark. The fire was low enough now that its light didn't reach the top of the stairs clearly. But something was at the top of them. Walsh could see the edge of it. A shape, just at the boundary of the firelight, just where the staircase opened into the upper room. A man, standing at the top of the stairs. In the dark, he was dressed. Walsh could see this much, in clothing that was wrong. Wrong for 1944, wrong for Allied forces, wrong for German forces, wrong for any military Walsh had encountered in his 6 weeks of war. Dark clothing, heavy, with something on the head, a helmet, but not any helmet. Walsh recognized a different shape, a different era, and across his chest, a strap, a broad diagonal strap, from which hung something that was also wrong, also old, also from a time that this building remembered, and this war did not. He stood at the top of the stairs, and he looked at them, or seemed to look at them. Walsh understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that the man at the top of the stairs was not looking at them at all, was not aware of them, was looking at the room with the focused, practical gaze of a man assessing his working space at the start of a shift, noting the position of things, calculating what needed to be done in what order. He took a step into the room. Cooper was on his feet. "Hey," Cooper said. "Hey, stop." The man walked across the room, through the room, with complete indifference to the 3 men and 1 boy in it. with the purposeful step of someone who knows exactly where he is going and has not noticed any obstacle in his path. And there were obstacles in his path. Walsh's kid on the floor, the chair Cooper had just vacated, the space where Walsh himself was lying, and he did not deviate. He walked through the room, and Walsh felt, as he passed, a coldness. Not the cold of the air, which was already cold. A different cold. A cold that came from the inside rather than the outside, from somewhere below the skin. The man went to the far wall. He stood in front of it. He appeared to examine something on the wall, something none of them could see. Then he reached out and appeared to adjust something, turn something, tighten or loosen something that existed in his version of the room and not in theirs. Then he walked back to the stairs. He went down them, and the room was empty again, and the fire gave its low light, and the machinery turned below, and Cooper was standing in the middle of the room with his rifle half raised and his mouth slightly open, and the expression of a man whose entire operating framework has just been presented with information it cannot process. Walsh sat up. He looked at Cooper. Cooper lowered his rifle very slowly. He sat back down in the chair. He said nothing for a long time. Then, I don't. He stopped. He tried again. That wasn't. He stopped again. He looked at Walsh. Walsh looked at him. The voices, Walsh said, downstairs. Before. Did Croft tell you about the voices? Cooper shook his head. There were voices, Walsh said. 2 men. Talking. Croft went down. Nobody there. Cooper processed this. What language? Cooper said. French. Old French. Thick. Cooper nodded very slowly. He looked at the stairs. The guy, he said. Just now. His uniform. He paused. That wasn't German. No, Walsh said. And it wasn't ours. No. Cooper was quiet for a moment. What year was the first war? He said. Started 1914, Walsh said. Ended 1918. Cooper nodded. He looked at the stairs. Huh, he said. It was, Walsh thought, the most inadequate response to the situation available, and simultaneously the most accurate. Luke had watched all of it. Walsh realized this when he looked at the boy's corner and found him awake. Had perhaps been awake all along, through the voices and through Croft's descent and through the figure at the top of the stairs. He was sitting in exactly the position he had been in when Walsh last looked at him, knees drawn up, back against the wall. But his eyes were open now, and they were on Walsh with a look that contained, underneath its exhausted surface, something that was trying to be a warning and had perhaps given up on being heard. Walsh crossed to him. He sat beside him. Luke, he said quietly, your grandfather, he died in this mill? The boy looked at him. In 1916, Walsh said, in the First War. Luke was quiet for a long moment. Then, very quietly, he said, Pas seulement lui. Not only him. Walsh looked at the stairs, at the floor, at the machinery turning below in the dark, patient and rhythmic and completely indifferent to the year. How many? Walsh said. Luke looked at his hands. He held up his fingers. All of them. 10. Then he lowered his hands and looked at the floor and said nothing else. And Walsh sat beside him in the low firelight and listened to the mill turn and understood that the night had a long way still to go. Croft took the news the way Croft took most news, standing still, listening completely, and then being quiet for a measured amount of time before saying anything. Walsh had woken him at 6, which was earlier than his rotation required, but later than Walsh had wanted to, because Walsh had wanted to wake him immediately after the figure on the stairs, and had overruled himself on the grounds that waking the sergeant because of a ghost seemed like exactly the kind of thing that would earn you a particular kind of look. By 6, with 3 more appearances on the ground floor, all of them glimpsed through the gap in the staircase, all of them men in the wrong uniforms moving through the space with the focused purpose of men at work. Walsh felt he had sufficient evidence to justify the disruption. He told Croft everything. The voices, the figure at the top of the stairs, the cold that came with him, Luce's 10 fingers. Croft listened. Then he was quiet for 30 seconds. Then, show me. They went downstairs together, Walsh and Croft, in the gray pre-dawn light that was coming through the narrow ground floor windows and flat, colorless sheets. The milling floor was exactly as it had been the night before. The millstones, the hoppers, the machinery turning slowly. No figures, no voices. Croft walked the space methodically. He stopped at a point near the far wall, between the millstones and the wooden hopper structure. He crouched and looked at the floor. Walsh came to stand beside him. The floor was stone, old flagstone, worn smooth by decades of use. But at this point, in the morning light, Walsh could see something he had missed in the dark. The stone was marked, not carved, worn. The surface of the flagstone worn in a specific pattern, a shallow depression perhaps 2 inches long and an inch wide, repeated at intervals across this section of the floor. The pattern of repeated standing. The pattern of feet in the same position, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. The shape of a man standing at his work, worn into the stone. Not one man, several, different positions, different heights. The worn marks of multiple men standing at multiple positions across this working floor. Worn so deep into the stone that nothing, not abandonment, not 2 world wars, not the indifferent passage of time, had been able to erase them. Croft stood. He looked at the millstones. He looked at the shaft turning in the wall. "How long has this mill been here?" he said. Walsh didn't know. "Old," he said. Walsh didn't know. "Old," he said. "Very old." Croft nodded. "Right," he said. He went back upstairs. By the time the gray morning had fully established itself, gray being the only option this sky was offering, gray in all directions and at all depths, the gray of a day that had no intention of becoming anything warmer. All 4 of them were awake and sitting around the remains of the fire, and the unspoken subject of the night was sitting with them. Cooper had said very little since the figure on the stairs. This was notable because Cooper's default was to say a great deal on any subject with or without relevant information, as a kind of ongoing ambient commentary on the world around him. His silence was therefore specific. He was processing. Walsh could see it, the way Cooper held his mug of water and looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man performing a very thorough internal audit of his own beliefs. "So," Cooper said finally, "ghosts." Nobody responded. "That's what we're saying," Cooper said. "We're sitting here saying ghosts." "We're not saying anything," Croft said. "I'm saying it." Cooper said, "I'm saying ghosts because what I saw last night was a man walk through this room and through my kit and through the wall." He pointed at the far wall. "And come back and do it again twice. And I have a college education and I was raised Methodist, and neither of those things has given me a framework for what I saw, so I'm going with ghosts because at least ghosts is a category." Silence. "The first war," Walsh said. Cooper looked at him. "Luke's grandfather died here in 1916, Walsh said. "Him and 9 others, in the first war. Whatever happened here?" He looked at Luke. "What happened here, Luke, in the first war?" The boy was looking at the fire. He was quiet for a long time. Then he began to speak. His French was slow this time, slower than before, more deliberate, as though he was choosing each word with care, as though the choosing of the words was itself an act of some difficulty. Walsh caught perhaps 2/3 of it, enough to follow the shape of the story without all of its detail. The mill had been a working mill in 1916, his great-grandfather's mill. The miller then, the family had run it for 3 generations before the First War. When the German advance came through the Ardennes in 1914, the mill had been requisitioned, first by one side, then by the other, then by the first side again, the way things were requisitioned in a war that moved back and forth across the same ground for 4 years, without either side being able to hold it. In the winter of 1916, a group of French soldiers had sheltered here. 10 of them. A night like this night, cold and dark. The mill at the edge of the forest. They had made a fire upstairs and slept in rotation, the way soldiers slept. By morning 9 of them were dead. Walsh waited. "How?" he said. Luke shook his head. "On ne sait pas," he said. "We don't know." "And the 10th?" Walsh said. Luke looked at the floor. "Il n'a jamais parlé," he said. He never spoke. The room was very quiet. "Your grandfather," Walsh said. "He was the 10th. Luke didn't answer. He didn't need to. Cooper was looking at the wall where the figure had disappeared. He was looking at it with the expression of a man who has revised his position on a subject he thought was settled. 9 men, he said. 9 men died in this building one night in 1916, and we are currently in this building." He paused. "Sergeant." "I hear you, Cooper," Croft said. I want to leave. It'll be light in 2 hours. I want to leave now." Croft looked at him steadily. "The temperature outside is -12. The forest between here and the road is 8 kilometers, in the dark, with German patrols." He paused. "We leave at first light." Cooper looked at the wall. 2 hours, he said. 2 hours, Croft said. Cooper picked up his rifle and held it in his lap and looked at the wall and said nothing else. Walsh looked at Luke. The boy was still looking at the fire. His face in the firelight was the face Walsh had looked at since they found him on the road. The face that was older than 16 in the ways that mattered, and he understood now where that age had come from. Not the occupation, or not only the occupation, this building. This family history, the weight of a story that had been sitting in his bloodline since 1916, and that he had been carrying alone since old enough to understand it. Walsh thought about the 10th man, the great-grandfather who survived, who never spoke. He thought about what it might have cost, that silence. He looked at the floor, at the machinery turning below, patient and mechanical and old. He looked at the far wall where the figure had disappeared, and for the first time since they had come inside, in the specific way that understanding arrived not as thought but as sensation, as a change in the temperature of the air around a realization. He understood what was happening in this mill, not haunting, not malice, memory. The mill was simply remembering the men it had held in 1916, the men who had come in from the cold and made their fire and slept in rotation and never left. They were still here the way the worn marks in the stone were still here, the way the smell of flour dust was still in the walls. Because the mill was old and the mill's memory was old, and the mill did not distinguish between what was present and what had been, between the living and the dead who had been living here once. It simply kept turning and kept remembering. And in the memory, 10 men were still here, still at their work, still on their watch, still moving through the space with the focused purpose of men who had something to do and intended to do it. Walsh sat with this understanding and felt it settle into him like the cold, not as shock, but as a quiet, enormous weight. He looked at Luke. "Does it always do this?" he said. "When people stay here, does it always show them?" Luke looked at him. "Toujours," he said. "Always." The apparitions came more frequently as the morning approached. This was the opposite of what Walsh had expected. He had assumed, with the logic of a man whose understanding of supernatural things was constructed entirely from childhood stories, that ghosts operated in darkness and retreated with the light. That dawn was the natural end of whatever this was. He had been wrong. As the gray morning deepened and the light through the windows shifted from black to the flat, colorless gray of Ardennes' winter day, the figures on the ground floor became more present, more frequent, more visible, not more threatening. That was the thing Walsh kept returning to. They were not threatening, they were simply there. The men of 1916 in their wrong uniforms going about the business of the mill, and the business of a war that had been over for 26 years, with a complete absorption of people who had no idea they were being watched. Walsh saw, through the staircase gap, a man hauling a sack of grain across the milling floor, the movement of it so completely physical and real that Walsh's hand had gone to his rifle before his mind caught up with what he was seeing. He saw 2 men at the millstones, working, checking the grain, talking to each other in that thick French that was just below comprehension. He saw a man sitting against the far wall with his head back and his eyes closed, asleep or resting, his rifle across his knees, in the position of a man on watch who has given in to the weight of the night for just a moment. He saw, and this was the one that stayed with him, the one he would carry longest, a man standing at the ground floor window, looking out at the stream and the wheel and the forest, with his hands in his pockets and his face turned toward the light in the way a man turned his face toward the light when he had been inside for a long time and was trying to remember what the outside world looked like. He stood there for a long time, that figure, just looking at the light. Walsh watched him from the top of the stairs and felt the weight of the mill's memory pressing down on him like the low gray sky outside, and felt something shift inside his chest that would not shift back. It was Cooper who first understood what was happening to them. This was unexpected. Walsh would have predicted Croft who noticed everything, who trusted his instincts, who had been reading situations correctly for 4 years of war, or himself perhaps because he had been watching most carefully. But it was Cooper who said it, at approximately 7 in the morning, sitting in the chair by the window with his rifle across his knees and his eyes on the stairs, in the flat, quiet voice of a man who has worked something out and is not pleased about it. "It's taking something," Cooper said. Walsh looked at him. The mill, Cooper said. Whatever is happening in this building, it's taking something from us. What do you mean? Walsh said. Cooper was quiet for a moment, assembling the words with unusual care. Last night, he said, when I saw the guy on the stairs, the one in the wrong uniform, I felt. He stopped, started again. You know when you see something that your mind just won't accept? That moment, right at the start, when what you're seeing and what you believe is possible are running against each other, and the feeling of something being wrong. Yes, Walsh said. I don't feel that anymore, Cooper said. Walsh looked at him. I should, Cooper said. Right now, sitting here, I should feel that. I should feel it about everything I saw last night. Instead, I feel. He paused. Normal. I feel normal about it, like it's been filed somewhere, and I can't find where it was filed, and I can't get back to feeling what I felt when I saw it. And that feeling, that wrongness feeling, I think that's what's gone. Walsh thought about this. He thought about the voices, about the cold that came with the figure on the stairs. He thought about lying on the floor listening to the voices and feeling, after a while, not frightened, but simply present. Simply there, in the mill, with the machinery turning and the voices below, as though the extraordinary had been reclassified while he wasn't looking. He thought about whether he would recognize what was missing if it was gone. He looked at Croft. Croft was standing at the window. He had been standing at the window for 20 minutes in a specific way, still, with his hands behind his back, looking out at the stream and the wheel turning in the water. He had not moved. He had not spoken. He had not done the thing Walsh had learned to watch for, which was the slow scan of the room that Croft performed every few minutes. The habitual professional assessment of a man who was always, on some level, checking the room. He had stopped checking the room. Walsh stood. He crossed to Croft. Sergeant, he said. Croft turned from the window. His face was... It was Croft's face. All the right elements in the right arrangement, but something in it was differently weighted, as though the things that usually occupied the foreground had stepped back, and something quieter and older had moved into their place. We should go, Walsh said. Croft looked at him. First light, he said. It is first light, Walsh said. Sergeant, it's been first light for 30 minutes. Croft looked at the window. He looked at the gray morning outside, the stream, the wheel, the forest pressing in beyond. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone who has been watching it for much longer than 30 minutes. Right, he said. He did not move immediately. Walsh put a hand on his arm. Now, Sergeant, he said. Croft blinked. He looked at Walsh's hand on his arm as though being reminded of the existence of his arm. Then something shifted in his face. Refocused, sharpened, came back from wherever it had been, and he straightened, and the sergeant was back. The real one, the Western Desert veteran with the calibrated instincts and the unfailing situational awareness. But for a moment, just a moment, he had been somewhere else. Somewhere that looked, Walsh thought, very much like the mill had looked to the man in the window, like somewhere you stood and looked at the light and forgot that you had intended to leave. Cooper, Croft said. Luke, on your feet. We're leaving. They gathered their kit in the quick, economical way of soldiers who had done this many times. Roll the ground sheet, secure the pack, check the rifle, check the ammunition, check the man beside you. Cooper moved with his customary efficient speed. Walsh moved with slightly more urgency than usual. Luke moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who wanted to be very certain he was taking everything he had brought in with him and leaving nothing behind. Croft stood near the stairs. He stood with his pack on and his rifle in his hands, and he looked at the room. One final survey, the proper one this time, the full rotation of the practiced eye checking every corner and every shadow. He stopped. His gaze had stopped at the shelf on the far wall. Walsh looked at the shelf. There were 3 objects on it. There had been 3 objects on it since they arrived, and Walsh had looked at them with his torch briefly the night before and filed them away. A tin cup, a small book, some kind of ledger or journal, very old, the cover dark with age, and a photograph in a simple wooden frame propped against the wall. Croft was looking at the photograph. Walsh crossed to the shelf and looked at it properly for the first time. The photograph was old, early 20th century, sepia-toned, the particular quality of photographs from before the First War, when photography was still new enough to be an occasion. It showed a group of men standing in front of the mill, outside, by the stream, with the wheel visible behind them. 10 men. in the clothing of mill workers and, 2 or 3 of them, in the uniform of French soldiers. They were standing in the way people stood for photographs of that era, with the self-conscious solemnity of people who understood they were being recorded and were uncertain what face to present to the record. Walsh counted them. 10. He looked at their faces. The small, slightly blurred faces of men photographed in 1916 or thereabouts. The faces of men who had, at this moment, a future they did not yet know was about to be taken from them. He looked for the 10th man. The survivor. The one who came out. He thought he found him. A young man at the far left of the group, thinner than the others, with a face that was... There was something about the face. Something familiar in the line of the jaw, the set of the eyes. Walsh looked at it for a long moment. He looked at Luke. Luke was standing near the stairs, pack on, ready to go, looking at anything in the room except the shelf. Walsh looked at the photograph again. He looked at the young man at the far left. He looked at Luke. Luke, he said quietly. The boy looked at him. Walsh tilted his head toward the photograph. Luke looked at it for a long moment. His face did the thing it had been doing all night. The thing that was not quite fear and not quite grief. The thing that sat in the space between the two where people put things they have been carrying for long enough that carrying them has become the natural state. He looked at the young man at the far left of the photograph. He said, "Mon arrière-grand-père," my great-grandfather. Walsh looked at the photograph, at the young man who had survived, who had come out of this mill in 1916 when 9 men had not, who had never spoken about what happened, who had a great-grandson, who had brought 3 soldiers to this building on a December night in 1944, 30 years later, in a different war, in the same cold and the same dark. Walsh thought about that. He thought about what it meant that Luke had known what this building was and had brought them here anyway, whether it was the cold or the darkness or the lack of alternatives or something else, something older, something that ran in the blood of a family that had grown up in the shadow of this mill story. He didn't ask. He would not ask. Some things were not his to know. "Right," Croft said. "Let's go." They went to the stairs. On the ground floor, in the morning light, the mill was simply the mill, the machinery turning, the millstone still. The hoppers and chutes in the old dark ironwork of the gearing. The flagstones with their worn marks. The windows with the gray light coming in flat and cold. No figures, no voices, just the mill that crossed the floor in single file. Croft first, then Luke, then Walsh, then Cooper. And the sound of their boots on the flagstones was the only human sound in the building. And Walsh counted his steps across the floor the way you counted something when you needed to concentrate on a number instead of the things trying to occupy your mind. 14 steps to the door. Croft pulled it open. The cold came in immediately, the cold of outside, genuine and sharp and carrying the smell of the forest and the snow, and it was so much more real than the cold inside the mill that Walsh felt his whole body react to it. A loosening, a relief, the relief of a system returning to its known parameters. He stepped through the door, he crossed the footbridge, he stood on the far bank and turned and looked back at the mill. It stood as it had always stood, stone walls, steep roof, the wheel turning in the black water. Cold and dark and closed. The windows reflected the gray sky. The door was closing behind Cooper, who was the last one through, who stepped off the footbridge and onto the bank and did not look back. The wheel turned. The mill said nothing. They walked into the forest. The forest received them without ceremony. This was what forests did. They simply continued indifferent to the particular human dramas occurring at their edges, the trees doing what trees had always done, which was stand and grow and make shade and pay no attention to the wars being fought in the clearings between them. The snow was still on the ground, hard-crusted, breaking underfoot with a sound that carried in the cold air. The sky above the canopy was the same flat gray it had been at the window of the mill. The same gray it had been for 3 days, the kind of sky that was going to be gray for a long time yet, and had no apologies to make about it. They walked in single file, Croft at the front, Luke behind him, Walsh behind Luke, Cooper at the rear. They walked in the silence of people who have been through something together and have not yet found a language for it, not the comfortable silence of men who don't need to speak. Something more specific, more interior. The silence of 4 people each occupied with their own private inventory, checking themselves the way you checked your kit after a difficult crossing, methodically, carefully, looking for what was missing. Walsh was doing this. He had been doing it since they crossed the footbridge and the cold outside hit him, and he felt the loosening, the relief, and then underneath the relief, something else, a small, precise absence. Something that had been there when he entered the mill and was not there when he left it. He could feel the shape of the absence, the way you felt a missing tooth with your tongue, by the space, by the gap, by the place where something used to be and now wasn't. He couldn't name it yet. He walked and he tried to name it. The logging track they were following ran northeast, which was the direction of the Allied line, which was the direction of everything that constituted safety and warmth and the ordinary machinery of the war as Walsh understood it. Croft had the map. Croft always had the map. He held it now as he walked, checking it with the brief, efficient glances of a man who had been reading terrain for 6 years and trusted his feet as much as the paper. He had not spoken since the mill. This was not unusual. Croft was not a man who spoke for the sake of it, but Walsh had learned to read the quality of his silences, and this one was different from his normal silence, which was the silence of a man thinking. This was the silence of a man who was trying to think and finding that the machinery of thought was running slightly differently than he was used to. Slightly slower, slightly less precise. Walsh watched him from behind. Croft's stride was his normal stride, measured even, covering ground without appearing to hurry. His posture was correct. His rifle was carried correctly. All the external signals said, this is a man fully operational, fully present, fully the sergeant he had always been. But twice in the first hour, he checked the map, and then looked up at the tree line and stood for a moment too long. 3 or 4 seconds too long, as though the tree line were telling him something that required more consideration than usual. And once he stopped completely, stood in the middle of the track, and looked back the way they had come with an expression Walsh couldn't see from behind but could feel. The particular quality of a man looking back at something he had left. Then he walked on. Walsh said nothing. They rested at the 2-hour mark. A fallen beech tree across the track served as a seat, wide enough and dry enough on the top surface where the snow had slid off. Cooper sat at one end, Walsh at the other, Luke between them. Croft stood. He always stood on rest breaks, which Walsh had initially attributed to some sergeant's principle about remaining alert and now suspected had more to do with the fact that a man who sat down in the cold had a harder time standing back up, and Croft was very invested in always being able to stand back up. Cooper ate. He ate with the focused efficiency of a man who had decided that the primary available comfort was food and was pursuing it with commitment. He did not look up while he ate. He did not speak. He was, Walsh could see, still doing his inventory, still going through himself, checking things, looking for the gap. Walsh drank from his canteen. The water was very cold. He held it in his mouth for a moment before swallowing, the way he had started doing in the last week, not because it made the water better, but because the sensation of it was specific and physical and present, and specific physical present sensations were useful things to have when your mind was doing complicated things you hadn't asked it to do. He looked at Luke. The boy was sitting with a piece of black bread in his hands, eating it slowly, looking at the forest ahead of them. His face in the gray morning light he looked younger, Walsh thought. Younger than he had looked in the mill, as though the building had been pressing down on him and the removal of it had allowed him to return to something closer to his actual age. 16. He was 16 years old and he had guided 3 soldiers through a dark forest to a building he knew was wrong and had sat all night while that building did what it did and had said very little about any of it. Luke, Walsh said. The boy looked at him. Why did you bring us here? Walsh said. You knew what it was. You could have taken us somewhere else. Luke looked at the bread in his hands. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in French slow enough for Walsh to follow, Il n'y avait nulle part ailleurs. There was nowhere else. Walsh nodded. He supposed that was true. The forest was large. The night had been cold. The alternatives had been the open road in -12 with German patrols, and a boy with a coat and 1 disintegrating boot. But he didn't entirely believe it. He thought about the great-grandfather in the photograph. The young man at the far left, the one who had survived, who had never spoken. He thought about 30 years of a story living in a family's blood. Did you want to know? Walsh said. What happened to him? Your great-grandfather. What he saw. Did you think the mill would show you the way it showed us? Luke was very still. He looked at the bread. He said nothing. Which was, Walsh thought, as clear an answer as language. He thought about that. About a 16-year-old boy carrying a 30-year silence, carrying the weight of a story that had never been told, and deciding, in the cold and the dark and the necessity of a winter night, that perhaps this was the moment, that perhaps if he brought the right people to the right place, the mill would finally say what his great-grandfather never had. He thought about whether the mill had said it, whether any of what they had seen was the answer to that question. He didn't know. He suspected Luke didn't know either, and he suspected that not knowing was something Luke would carry now, the way his great-grandfather had carried the silence, not resolved, not released, but differently weighted, changed in some small way by having finally gone inside. "Allons-y," Croft said. "Let's go." They stood and walked. The forest thinned after the third hour, not dramatically. The Ardennes didn't thin dramatically, it wasn't that kind of forest. But the trees became less close, the canopy less absolute, the gray sky showing in wider sections above. The logging track became wider, more defined. The ruts of vehicle tires visible beneath the snow where heavy machinery had passed sometime in the previous weeks and compressed the ground beneath. Signs of the war returning. A rusted piece of shrapnel in the snow at the track's edge. A section of communications wire draped across a tree branch, its origin and destination both invisible. Once, far to the east, the sound of artillery, brief and then gone, like a door opening and closing. Walsh breathed. He was aware, as the forest opened and the signs of the ordinary war reasserted themselves, of something shifting inside him, not the absence. That was still there, still present as a shape and an emptiness he hadn't yet named. Something alongside it. Something that had to do with the quality of the night just past. He thought about the man at the window, the WW2 soldier, the French soldier, the ghost of a man from 1916, standing at the ground floor window of the mill and looking out at the stream and the wheel and the light coming through the trees, looking at it with the expression of a man who has been inside for a long time and is trying to remember what the outside world looks like. Walsh thought about that for a long time as he walked. He thought about what it meant to be trapped in a moment, to be a man on watch in a mill in 1916 and to be so thoroughly in that moment that 26 years passed outside while you were still in it, still at your post, still going through the motions of that one night, that one watch, that one winter in the Ardennes that had become. Through whatever mechanism operated in the mill, through whatever kept those men there, the only night that existed. He thought about whether he understood that. He thought, walking through the thinning forest with his pack on his back and his rifle in his hands, and the gray December sky above and the frozen ground beneath, whether he could locate within himself some version of the feeling those men must have had, the particular exhaustion of 1916, the particular cold, the knowledge, which all soldiers had, that you might not leave this place, that this place, this specific place, this mill, this forest, this stream, might be the last thing you saw. He thought he could locate it. He thought he could locate it quite precisely, actually, and that was when he found the absence. He stopped walking. He stood on the logging track in the gray December morning, and he found the thing the mill had taken from him, and he stood with it for a moment, just standing with it the way you stood with a thing once you had found it, because finding it and knowing what to do about it were two different operations. Cooper almost walked into him. "Walsh," Cooper said. "What?" "I'm all right," Walsh said. He was not entirely all right, but he started walking again, because that was what you did. What the mill had taken from him, Walsh understood as he walked, was this: the ability to imagine going home, not the desire. The desire was still there, intact, urgent. The ordinary soldier's fierce and sustaining vision of the future beyond the war. Not the belief exactly. Something more specific, the ability to picture it, to close his eyes and see the specific images, the street, the house, the faces, with the clarity and immediacy of things that were real and waiting, that capacity for vivid futureward vision that had kept him sane for 6 weeks of winter campaign had been not removed, dimmed, grayed out, like a window that has had something applied to it that lets the light through but takes the definition away. He could feel the shape of home. He could not see it clearly. He walked. He told himself it would come back. He told himself it was the exhaustion, the cold, the night without sleep, the things he had seen in the mill that his mind was still processing. He told himself there was nothing that a proper sleep in a proper bed would not resolve entirely. He almost believed it. Cooper found his absence at the edge of the forest. Walsh knew this because Cooper, who had been silent for 3 hours, suddenly stopped at the place where the logging track met an open road and stood at the tree line with a very specific expression on his face and said quietly, without the performative quality of his usual speech, with something underneath the words that Walsh had not heard in Cooper's voice before, "I can't remember what my mother looks like." Walsh stopped beside him. Cooper was looking at the road. "I know her," Cooper said. "I know everything about her. I know her voice and her laugh and the way she moves and the smell of the kitchen when she's been cooking. I know all of it, but her face." He paused. "I can't see her face." Walsh said nothing. "That's new," Cooper said. That wasn't true yesterday." Walsh looked at the road, at the gray sky above it, at the empty landscape beyond. "It'll come back," Walsh said. Cooper looked at him. He looked at him with the eyes of a man who has just had something taken from him by a process he doesn't understand and has no mechanism for recovering. "Yeah," Cooper said. "He said it the way you said something you needed to be true and were not certain was." They walked out of the forest and onto the road. Croft said nothing about his absence. Not then, not later. This was consistent with everything Walsh knew about him. Croft's interior life was a country with very controlled borders, and what it imported and exported was entirely at his discretion. But Walsh watched him on the road, and Walsh had spent 6 weeks watching Croft make decisions, and he noticed. The decisions were the same. The information processing was the same. The tactical assessment, the positioning, the management of the group across open ground. All of it was exactly right, exactly what it should be. But the certainty was different, not absent. Croft was not uncertain in any way that would compromise his function. But underneath the certainty, underneath the professional competence and the calibrated instincts, something that had been absolute was now slightly less than absolute, a hairline adjustment in the foundations. The kind of thing that only someone who knew the building very well would notice. Walsh noticed. He didn't know what it meant. He walked. Luke said nothing about his absence, but Walsh thought he knew what it was. The boy walked through the last kilometer of forest and out onto the road and across the open ground toward the Allied position with the same careful deliberateness he had moved with all night. He was not diminished. He was not damaged in any way Walsh could point to. He was 16 and thin and had one boot coming apart and had spent a night in his great-grandfather's mill watching the dead go about their business. And he walked with a quality that Walsh, trying to find the word for it, could only call settled, not resolved, not healed, not the bittersweet piece of something understood, just settled, as though something that had been restless inside him for a very long time had found, not an answer, but a position it could occupy without constant movement, as though the story that had lived in his blood since 1916 had finally, in some way he would never be able to explain, been acknowledged, not ended. Not explained, simply acknowledged. The mill had taken something from him too. Walsh thought what it had taken was the question, not the answer. The mill didn't have answers. Walsh was certain of that now, but the question that the boy had been carrying since he was old enough to understand what his great-grandfather had survived. What happened? What did he see? What was in that building? That question had been replaced by something quieter, not knowledge. Just the experience of having been there, of having been in the mill on a night when the mill did what the mill did, and having come out the other side with the fact of it, the question replaced by the simple, enormous fact of having been present. Walsh supposed that was something. Whether it was enough, he couldn't say. They reached the Allied position at 10:30 in the morning. It was a farmhouse 3 kilometers from the forest edge, requisitioned and converted into a company command post, with the pragmatic efficiency of an army that had been doing this for 5 years and had developed strong opinions about the minimum requirements for a functional command post, which included a working wireless, a stove that produced consistent heat, and enough room for the company commander to spread a map without it falling off the table. Captain Alderton met them at the door. He was a compact, efficient man in his 40s with the expression of someone who had been expecting 3 men and a Belgian civilian to appear out of the Ardennes forest approximately 6 hours ago, and had spent those 6 hours revising his estimate of their fate in an increasingly pessimistic direction. "Croft," he said. "Sir," Croft said. "You're late." "Yes, sir." Alderton looked at the 4 of them, the general assessment, the quick check for damage, the accounting. "Anyone hurt?" "No, sir." "Good." He stood back from the door. "Come in. There's tea. There was tea. Walsh drank 2 mugs of it standing by the stove, and the heat of it, and the heat of the stove, and the solid functional reality of the command post, the wireless operator at his set, the maps on the table, the smell of wood smoke and tobacco and wet wool, all of it pressed against him like something physical, the ordinary world, reasserting itself. The world of the war, which was a terrible world, but a world whose rules he understood and whose geography he could navigate. He was glad to be in it. He was surprised by how glad he was. He stood by the stove and drank his tea and watched Cooper do the same thing at the other end of the stove, and watched Croft report to Alderton in the low, concise shorthand of a sergeant debriefing his officer, and watched Luke sit in the corner of the room with his hands around a mug of something hot and his eyes on the floor. He thought about the mill. He thought about the man at the window. He thought about the worn marks in the flagstone floor. The depressions of feet standing at work, year after year, decade after decade, worn into the stone so deeply that nothing could erase them. He thought about what that meant. That the stone remembered the weight of the men who had stood on it. That the memory was physical, was actual, was written into the material of the building in a language that wasn't language. He thought about what was written into him, whether the night had left a mark of that kind. Worn something slightly different in the material of him, the way a repeated weight or a depression in stone, not taken something exactly, changed the surface, changed the depth of a groove that had already been there. He thought this might be a more accurate description than taking. The mill hadn't taken things from them the way you took something from a shelf. It had pressed. It had done what the weight of the men in 1916 had done to the flagstone, applied itself repeatedly over the course of one long night, and changed the surface of each of them in some small, specific, permanent way. He thought, is that haunting? He thought, is that what haunting is? Not a ghost in a house, not a thing that goes bump in the dark, just a place that has held so much of something. So much time, so much grief, so much human presence and human loss, that it cannot help but press some of it into anyone who stays long enough. He finished his tea. He held the mug. He was aware that the thinking he was doing, the careful, somewhat philosophical reconstruction of what had occurred in the mill, was itself a symptom of something. A man who hadn't just had a night in a strange mill came back and told his sergeant about it and ate his rations and slept. A man who had been changed by something came back and stood by a stove and tried to understand what had been changed and why and what it meant. He was the second kind of man now. He was fairly certain all 4 of them were. Alderton gave them 4 hours. This was the command post's standard provision for men returning from a difficult patrol: 4 hours of rest before reassignment, which was a compressed and inadequate period of time for rest in any meaningful sense of the word, but was what the war allowed and was better than nothing. Walsh slept on a ground sheet near the stove. He was not sure he expected to sleep. His mind was still moving, still turning things over, but he was wrong about this, which was a relief. He was asleep within minutes, the deep unconscious sleep of a body that had been awake for over 24 hours and had run out of arguments for staying awake. He dreamed. He did not dream of the mill. He dreamed of the logging track, the walk out through the forest, the snow underfoot, the gray sky above. He dreamed of walking through the forest alone without the others, in the particular quiet of a place where the only sound was his own footsteps and the distant, barely audible creak of a water wheel turning in a cold stream somewhere behind him. He walked away from the sound in the dream. The sound did not get quieter. He walked, and the forest was always the same forest, and the sound of the wheel was always the same distance behind him. And at some point he understood that this was not a dream about walking through a forest. It was a dream about the sound, about carrying it, about the fact that the distance between himself and the mill was not the same as the distance between himself and what the mill had done to him, and that the second distance was one he would be walking for a long time. He woke before the 4 hours were up. He lay on the ground sheet and looked at the ceiling of the farmhouse and listened. The wireless, the stove, Cooper breathing deeply and evenly at the other end of the room. He listened for the creak of the wheel. He did not hear it. He was not certain whether this was a relief. Cooper slept and dreamed and woke and said nothing about either. But Walsh watched him when he woke, and Cooper lay on his ground sheet for a long time after his eyes opened, looking at the ceiling with a quality of attention that was not the normal post's read blankness, but something more deliberate. Looking at the ceiling the way you looked at a thing when you were trying to see something that should be there but wasn't. Trying to see his mother's face. Walsh thought, It will come back. He thought, it has to come back. He thought, things that are taken can be recovered. He was not sure he believed any of these things, but he thought them with conviction, because Cooper was 22 years old and had had his mother's face taken from him by a mill in the Ardennes, and that was not something Walsh was prepared to accept as permanent. He thought it would come back with time. He thought that was what time did with things like this. He hoped he was right. Croft sat with Alderton for much of the 4 hours. Walsh saw them through the open door of the command post's inner room. Croft at the table, Alderton across from him, maps between them, the ongoing operational discussion of his sergeant and his company commander, normal, professional, exactly what it should look like. But once passing the door, Walsh caught a moment that was not quite that. Croft had stopped speaking. He was looking at the map, not reading it, not analyzing it, just looking at it with a quality of looking that was the same quality Walsh had seen at the window of the mill, when Croft had stood and looked out at the stream and the wheel and forgotten to do the scan of the room. Alderton was watching him. He said something Walsh didn't catch. Croft looked up. He came back. Walsh could see it. The same refocusing he had seen at the mill. The same return from wherever Croft went, when the thing the mill had taken from him made itself felt. The certainty reasserting itself over the hairline crack. He answered Alderton. He was the sergeant again. Walsh moved away from the door. He thought, whatever it costs him, he will manage it. Croft manages things. That is what Croft does. He thought, I hope the cost isn't too high. Luke was not there when Walsh came back from the inner room. He had been in the corner with his mug when Walsh lay down to sleep. He was not in the corner when Walsh woke. Walsh looked for him, the main room, the inner room, the lean-to at the back of the farmhouse where they had stacked their kit. He found him outside. Luke was standing in the farmhouse's small yard in the cold, looking east. Not at anything specific. At the sky, at the direction of the sky, at the particular quadrant of the gray horizon that Walsh, doing the arithmetic, calculated was roughly the direction from which they had come, the direction of the forest, the direction of the mill. Walsh stood in the farmhouse doorway and looked at him. The boy stood in the yard and looked east. He was still, completely still, in the way he had been still all night in his corner. The stillness of a person whose interior life was very active and whose exterior life had learned to be very quiet around it. He stood in the cold without his coat. He had no coat, Walsh remembered. He had had no coat when they found him. And he looked east, and he did not appear to feel the cold. Walsh went back inside. He came back with his own spare shirt. Not much, but something, and he went out and put it around Luke's shoulders without comment. The boy looked at him. Walsh said nothing. Luke looked east again. Il savait, he said, quietly, almost to himself. He knew. Walsh understood he was talking about his great-grandfather, the 10th man, the survivor. Il savait qu'il avait là-dedans, Luke said. He knew what was in there. Yes, Walsh said. Et il n'a jamais parlé. And he never spoke. No, Walsh said. Luke was quiet for a moment. Parce qu'il ne pouvait pas, he said. Because he couldn't. Walsh looked at the horizon, at the gray sky above the tree line. I know, he said. Luke looked at him. Something passed across the boy's face. Brief, almost submerged. The expression of someone who has been alone with something for a very long time and has just, unexpectedly, found that they are not entirely alone with it after all. It did not resolve anything. It was not supposed to resolve anything. But it was something. It was, perhaps, exactly the thing the boy had needed from this night, and had not known he needed, and would carry now differently from how he had carried it before. They stood in the cold yard together and looked east, and the gray sky held the forest in its gray, and the forest held the mill in its dark, and the mill turned in the stream as it had always turned, as it would continue to turn, patient and indifferent and full of its own enormous memory. Walsh stood and breathed. He was very cold. He did not go inside. Winter in the Ardennes continued. It continued the way winters continued in places that had committed fully to the proposition of winter, without interruption, without apology, without any suggestion that the season was considering its options. The snow stayed. The sky stayed gray. The temperature did not rise above freezing for the remainder of December, and when January came it brought more of the same, more gray, and more cold, and more of the particular quality of that winter in that place. which was the quality of a world that had been at war for so long that even the weather had taken on a military character. Relentless, indifferent, committed to the objective without regard for the cost, the four of them were separated within a week. Croft's platoon was reassigned north toward the Moss. Walsh went with him, as Walsh was in Croft's platoon and went where Croft's platoon went, which was the nature of the arrangement. Cooper's unit was part of a different formation and moved east with the American advance into Germany. Luke. Walsh did not know exactly what happened to Luke, because the war made keeping track of individual Belgian civilians difficult. But he knew that Alderton had passed him to a resistance contact in the next village, and that the resistance contact had given him boots and a coat and food, and that Luke had, as far as Walsh could determine, continued to exist, which was the most you could say about most people in the winter of 1944 in that part of the world. Walsh wrote Cooper a letter in January. Cooper wrote back in February. The letter was long by Cooper's standards, 2 pages, which Walsh suspected represented the maximum volume of words Cooper had ever committed to paper in a single sitting. It covered the advance into Germany, the state of Cooper's feet, a detailed complaint about American Army rations, and a description of a farmhouse outside Aachen that Cooper had found interesting for reasons that were not explained, but that Walsh, reading between the lines, understood had to do with the farmhouse being old and strange and full of a particular quality of silence that Cooper, before December, would have had no language for. At the end of the letter, almost as a postscript, Cooper wrote, "Her face came back. Took about 3 weeks. Woke up one morning and it was just there again. Thought you'd want to know." Walsh read this 3 times. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket and held his hand flat against it for a moment. He did not write back immediately. He sat with the information. 3 weeks. The face coming back. The thing the mill had dimmed returning to its proper brightness in 3 weeks, it was something. It was not a permanent taking. Whatever the mill did was not permanent, or was not permanent in the same way for everyone, or was not permanent if you waited long enough and kept moving and kept being alive in the ordinary ways that kept people alive. He thought about his own absence, the grayed-out future, the dimmed capacity for clear vision of home. He tested it. He closed his eyes and tried to see. It was there, not as clear as before, still slightly grayed, still slightly lacking the absolute vividness of the version that had sustained him through 6 weeks of campaign. But there, he could see the street. He could see the house. He could see the faces of the people in it, though they were softer than he remembered them, less defined, as though seen through thin cloth rather than open air. He could see them. He had not tried to see them since the mill. He had been afraid to try. He sat with the fact of their presence, soft and slightly out of focus, but present, undeniably present, waiting with the patient quality of things that had been there all along and simply needed to be looked at. And he felt something in his chest that was close to relief but was warmer than relief. And, less temporary, he thought it is still there. He thought it was always still there. He thought the mill pressed on it and changed the surface, and I mistook the changed surface for the thing itself. He thought this was important. He thought he would try to remember it. Croft did not speak about the mill. Not to Walsh, not to anyone. Walsh was aware of. This was not surprising. Croft's relationship with the things that had happened to him was conducted entirely in private. In the interior country where Walsh had limited visa access, the Walsh watched him through January and February and into March, and what he saw was a man who was functioning exactly as he had always functioned, and who had somewhere underneath that function a hairline crack that was not getting worse, not getting better, not getting worse. Just there. A permanent slight adjustment in the foundations. The kind of thing that did not affect the structure's ability to stand, that most people looking at the building from outside would never notice, that only someone who knew the building very well could locate. Walsh knew the building very well. He watched the crack, and he watched Croft manage it with the same methodical, undramatic competence with which he managed everything. And he thought, that is what you do with the things that get into you. You manage them. You carry them. You continue to function. You don't talk about them because the words don't exist that carry them accurately. He thought about the 10th man. He thought about a young man in a photograph at the far left of a group who had come out of the mill in 1916 and gone home to a village and started a family and lived a life and never spoken a word about what he had seen in the mill at the edge of the Ardennes forest on a cold night in the First War. He thought, I understand that now. He thought, I did not understand it before. He thought, The mill gave me that, at least. The understanding of a silence that is not cowardice and not damage, but simply the recognition that some things exist outside the range of available language, and that forcing them into language does not illuminate them, but reduces them, and that the most honest response to certain kinds of experience is to carry them quietly and let them be what they are. He thought the 10th man had been right. He thought he might be wrong about that. He kept both thoughts. The war ended in May. Walsh heard about it on a Wednesday morning, from a corporal who came running across a muddy field in Germany shouting something that Walsh didn't understand, until the man was close enough to grab him by the arm and say it directly into his face. At which point Walsh understood and stood in the muddy field in Germany and felt the news arrive not as elation but as a profound, almost physical settling, the way a building settles when the pressure on its foundations is released, slowly, and a long exhale, finding its own level. He thought about going home. He tried the vision. It was there. It was clear, completely present. The street and the house and the faces as vivid as they had ever been, as real as the muddy field under his boots and the gray sky above. Just as real, just as specific, just as present. The mill had given it back. He stood in the field and let the vision be what it was and breathed and did not cry, because he was a soldier. And soldiers did not cry in muddy fields in Germany, and also because what he felt was not the kind of thing that cried. It was quieter than crying. It was the kind of thing that stood still for a moment and said nothing, and let the world settle around it. He thought about the man at the window, the French soldier, the ghost of 1916, standing at the ground floor window of the mill and looking out at the stream and the wheel and the light through the trees, looking at the outside world with the expression of someone who had been inside for a very long time. He thought, I hope you get to see it again. He thought, I hope whatever you are still waiting for, in that mill, in that night that never ended for you, I hope it comes. He stood in the field. The war was over. The Ardennes was behind him, weeks and months of campaign behind him. Winter giving way to the slow gray emergence of spring, giving way to the brief, thin warmth of a German May that was not really warm, but was warmer than December, was warmer than the mill, was warmer than the cold that had come off that figure on the stairs. He was going home. He could see it. He started walking. And in the Ardennes, at the edge of the forest, on the bank of the stream that ran dark and cold between the trees, the mill turned. The wheel turned in the water as it had always turned, the ice long gone from the paddles, the stream running free and fast with the melt of spring. The stone walls stood as they had always stood. The roof held. The windows reflected the light, gray in winter, green in spring, and sometimes on the clear days that came rarely to that valley, something approaching blue. On the ground floor the machinery moved as it had always moved, the shaft from the wheel, the gears engaging, the millstones cold and still, waiting, and in the morning light, or the evening light, or the deep specific dark of a December night, the mill remembered. It held what it had always held, the weight of the men who had worked here and slept here and kept watch here and, in one cold winter of one terrible war, died here. The worn marks in the flagstone floor, the sound in the walls, the particular quality of its silence, which was not the silence of emptiness. It would hold what it had taken from the 4 men who had sheltered in it in December 1944, too. The small things, the dimmed visions, the brief inability to see a mother's face, the hairline adjustment and a sergeant's foundations, the question a 16-year-old boy had brought into the building and left there, exchanged for something he could not yet name. It would hold all of it. The way it held everything, patiently, without judgment, without any particular awareness of the difference between what it was holding and what it had always held, between 1916 and 1944 and all the years before and all the years that would come after. It simply held. The wheel turned in the stream. The water moved below it, dark and cold, indifferent to the seasons. Finding its level, the forest stood around it, very old and very still, saying nothing, the way forests said nothing, with the particular authority of things that have been here longer than the things being done in them and will be here long after. And somewhere in the building, in the turning of the machinery and the weight of the stone and the memory pressed into the walls, 10 men went about their work, going about it still, going about it quietly, in the mill that remembered everything. At the edge of the forest, in the dark,